For those of you who don't know me, and I suspect many of you do, my day job is really just saving the planet. So which is, we've got a way to go. I work, as Gary said, on the international policy dimension of a major Griffith Uni research program that Professor Mackey over here, our previous speaker, leads, which has been a revelation, I guess, to me in many ways, including understanding in much more stark reality, I guess, of how disconnected the policy worlds of climate change and biodiversity conservation actually are. Myself and quite a few others, fortunately, have been working over the past many years to build bridges between the Biodiversity and the Climate Convention, and I guess to really foster a much greater level of understanding that we won't solve either the climate or biodiversity crisis unless we solve them together and do things that are good for people and good for nature. So a much more holistic approach, if you like, is needed to how we tackle both crises. And while connectivity conservation is making great strides in the CBD, it's an unheard of concept in the UNFCCC, something that I'm still trying to rectify. Next slide, thank you. So the previous slide, which talked about nature-based solutions, is partly in response to increasing recognition that the two crises, the climate and biodiversity crises, amplify each other. And at the moment, we're spiralling down the plug hole. So, as we damage biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, we actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. We increase the vulnerability of ecosystems to releasing greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. We make the climate crisis worse. It's not just that climate change is bad for biodiversity. Biodiversity loss and loss of ecosystem integrity is bad for climate change. So with connectivity conservation, we actually have an opportunity to reverse that spiral simply by all the work that we're doing, which is connecting, buffering existing natural areas, fostering natural regeneration, recovering species and processes. And you would think that that work, which actually improves the integrity of ecosystems, improves integrity at a large scale, you'd think that would be a flagship for nature-based solutions. But it isn't. It's, as I said, it's barely, well, no, I think it's effectively unheard of in the climate space. Next slide, please. So part of the reason we've had difficulty with this concept is there's been no definition. Now we've got one, thanks to United Nations passing one earlier this year, but it's not terribly helpful in that it doesn't really deal with, it doesn't focus in on the challenges that we face for climate and biodiversity and where the nexus between those two crises resides and what we need to do about them. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier, we've had some UNFCCC COP decisions, only two, one at COP25 and one at COP26, actually call for integrated action to prevent biodiversity loss and climate change, and at COP26 in Glasgow, actually calling for the protection and restoration of a whole suite of ecosystems, effectively not utilising the term nature-based solutions, and I'll come to the reasons for that a little bit later perhaps if there's time, but at least recognising that the nexus exists and the highest priority is actually to protect what we've already got. The IPCC, remarkably in Working Group 3 this year for the very first time identified protection as offering the highest mitigation value of any action we could do in the land and forest sector. That's in IPCC Working Group 3, Chapter 7. It also talked about the irrecoverability of carbon-rich ecosystems, that's by 2050, and the synergies between climate and biodiversity in species-rich ecosystems like primary forests and other undisturbed ecosystems. So all of the conversation is shifting I guess that's my main message, that there's a climate shift happening in at least both the science and starting to transition across into the policy arena. So those developments are very helpful, but they're a long way from translating into sort of programs and domestic policies and operational things on the ground. Next slide, please. The challenge is to actually promote what we're doing as both a climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity/ecosystem integrity solution. We have all the building blocks for success in these programs. We've got coalitions of the willing, of people who focus on their goals at both the community level but also the bigger picture level. My experience in both Gondwana Link and GER has been how much people appreciate being part of something that delivers a bigger picture outcomes. It's not just about what they're doing on their farm or in their local community. They can see how their work contributes to the movement of species A, B and C, to the overall integrity and health of ecosystems and landscapes within their region. It's really important to most people who contribute to these projects. I guess the policy aspect that we're not emphasising enough is that when we protect and restore biodiversity, we are helping to protect and restore the integrity of ecosystems and the supply of all ecosystem services, including long-term carbon storage. So the building blocks for success are not carbon. They're actually communities of willing people protecting and restoring biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. From that flows improved water retention in landscapes, improved carbon sequestration and storage. If we focus just in on carbon, we've got the wrong driver for action. Next slide, please. The other reason that focusing in on carbon is a challenge, and most nature-based solutions are talking about, predominantly thinking about a carbon outcome. But when we do that, people focus in on current very weak accounting and other information systems that don't tell you what you really need to know when you're looking at long-term climate mitigation and adaptation benefits in landscapes. Because they focus on annual fluxes of carbon, not the longevity of carbon storage. They're not comprehensive. They don't cover all ecosystems and all tenures. They don't reflect ecosystem dynamics. They're not holistic, so they don't necessarily help meet the aspirations of local communities and all the other and broader ecological objectives. And they absolutely ignore the importance of ecosystem condition or integrity. So if you focus just in on carbon, it's just about how much carbon comes in this year, what was the condition of that ecosystem that it came into? How vulnerable is it to loss? Those kinds of issues are not yet picked up in carbon accounting systems, and yet they're absolutely critical for the long-term success of climate mitigation in landscapes, as well as, obviously, for biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. Next slide, please. The other reason I think we struggle is we don't have our own metrics for success. We don't, none of us had the capacity to actually put in place long-term monitoring of what we're doing. We really do need monitoring and evaluation frameworks and metrics to properly assess how we're faring on climate mitigation and other ecosystem service benefits. What is happening to the integrity of ecosystems, to their resilience and adaptive capacity? And what impact are we having on community resilience and well-being? These are all the goals that connectivity conservation has, but we don't have long-term monitoring and we don't have the frameworks or metrics to assess our success. we intuitively know that, you know, we do no harm and that we do a lot of good, but we can't measure it. And that makes it very hard to fund. Next slide, please. Now, one of our colleagues, Brendan, my colleagues in the Griffith University research program, Dr. Heather Keith, has been involved in a small revolution in the United Nations on, of all things, ecosystem accounting. There are many features of this system that are a major breakthrough, but perhaps the most important of all for the sort of work that we're all trying to do is the reference level that's used is the natural reference level. As you can see, that's a very ecological definition of ecosystem integrity. That sits at the heart of the UN Statistical Commission's new ecosystem accounting framework. So when you think about all the carbon metrics that are out there, the baselines, if you like, the current condition, but it's looking at the counterfactual of what would be lost if you don't do action A. So it's assuming that to earn carbon credits, for instance, you have some baseline that's essentially based around damaged ecosystems, ongoing damage that's happening and ongoing loss. That's a relevant baseline, but you also need this. What is the condition? What is the natural condition of an ecosystem, and what's the real potential for recovery? So that's very helpful. It was only adopted last year, so it's a very new framework. It's already being promoted by myself and others as a potential bridge between the Rio Conventions, because the missing element in all the conventions actually is the concept of ecosystem integrity and how essential that is, whether it's for carbon storage and sequestration in landscapes, biodiversity, persistence, you name it. It's a unifying concept. Next slide, please. I assume all these presentations will be made available, but this is a slide of Dr. Keith's actually explaining the benefits of this new ecosystem accounting framework. And I won't go through it all now, but you'll see that reference level there is number 7, but also it's something that can apply to all ecosystems and all tenures, which current carbon accounting rules and metrics don't do. In fact, they very deliberately differentiate solely between managed and what they call unmanaged lands, and that's a political decision and very unhelpful if you're wanting to manage landscapes in a holistic way. Next slide. So part of the reason we need better metrics to assess how we're going is it's really hard to make an investment case. We need to be able to value the contribution to the quality of ecosystem services and assets at a landscape or program scale. We want to be able to value the contribution to resilience and risk reduction, and value the contribution to community resilience and well-being. So we actually have a major challenge, I think, for all the connectivity conservation programs, is to find a way to secure the funding to develop metrics that will work at all the various scales that we work in, whether it's at a small scale in a local community or, you know, whole of G-Link or whole of GER. So I just wanted to leave those few thoughts with you as we think about where we're headed with connectivity conservation and the depth of the contribution that we could make to solving both the biodiversity and climate crisis in Australia and globally. Thank you.